Malcolm, what about all these villas that are coming up on the air photographs in Northern Gaul, Somme in particular, and also around Trier? There are lots and lots of villas there. Are these settled soldiers, or are these native aristocracy coming through?
We don't know in either case. It's fair, I think, to stress that the villas in the Moselle region around Trier are by no means as dense as those in the valleys of the Aisne and the Somme. There, the picture is almost of a villa in every field, and as I was saying earlier, some of these very extensive indeed. We know hardly anything about their history. One has to remember that there was a tremendous devastation of Gaul, which presumably included these valleys, in the period just after the middle of the 3rd century AD, and it could be that some of these are new foundations after that time. I think that's on the whole unlikely. As I say, we know nothing about them at all on the ground. I wouldn't have thought myself that a considerable number of these in France or in Germany, in the Moselle Valley, are in fact retired soldiers, whether auxiliaries or legionaries. But in the absence of inscriptions, one can never be absolutely sure about this.
But if we just move on from people now, what about the relationships of the villas and the people who lived in them to the other elements in the settlement pattern? We've touched once or twice already on their relationship with cities, for example. Were the cities dependent on villas, or was it the other way around?
In the early Roman period, it does seem that large numbers of people whose wealth did come from the ownership of estates in the vicinity of a city did put their money and had money to put and were eager to put it into civic services. After all, they were the only people who would pay for it. The Roman government wouldn't pay for it, and also they would have to pay for many other amenities as well. Mm. What seems to have happened in the Middle and later Roman Empire is that the ownership of large areas of land in the provinces passed into hands of those persons who did not, for one reason or another, have what we would call these civic obligations. They may well have been parts of the estates of very rich people indeed, who had risen, as it were, out of a small-town aristocracy into the imperial aristocracy. In the late Roman period again, the church was certainly acquiring substantial property, which again was, as it were, taken out of this relationship between town and country. And I think it is certainly true that what we call the decline of the cities represents the inability of the surviving local, much depleted aristocracies to make contributions to city life. Whether they had the wherewithal to support themselves in great style on estates is far from clear. It's certainly a myth to suggest that, in a sense, withdrawing to the country meant that you escaped your taxation obligations. On the whole, the Roman government ignored the towns from taxes. They tend to tax the rural population. This was far more secure. It didn't run away, and on the whole, they didn't riot as well, as towns are very difficult places to deal with. So when we look at the later villas, and if the rather poor state of towns in the later empire, the archaeologist is perhaps entitled to see here a reflection of very substantial villas indeed, and one is thinking of examples that have been discovered, for example, in the territory of modern Hungary, in what on paper would appear quite remote areas of the Roman Empire, flourishing establishments going on to the end of the 4th century AD, or within a generation or so, before the Huns and other invaders came, more or less destroying any effective administration. So in the late empire, you do see this appearance of the large villa in the provinces, seeming to reflect, as it were, a withdrawal from the cities. But it seems that, in a sense, these were establishments on land which somehow were taken out of the traditional area of civic obligation.
And passed very often into imperial hands. We haven't mentioned this was a matter of imperial possession, and of course by the 4th century enormous tracts of the provinces were owned actually by the emperor.
I'm glad that John's moved into the later period, because this is the thing that fascinates us in Britain. Why were these splendid villas we find flourishing in the first half of the 4th century, and very few earlier ones of the same splendour and size? And this appears, as far as we can judge, to be a parallel with development in the towns, because you get the splendid large townhouses at the same period, although you do get a few earlier ones. I think here one has to explain how economically Britain was developing and progressing at this day, at this time. No one has produced a satisfactory explanation for this. Is it that the population is expanding? And how does it apply to other provinces? Because I know when I discuss it with my colleagues elsewhere, they instantly produce parallels as far away as Judea, where there appears to be a development of wealth and population in this late period. And are we dealing with a population explosion throughout larger parts of the empire, which accounts for this sudden wealth?
This is certainly true, Graham. I think this is a very good point indeed. Our impression of splendour, however, is more from the artistic decoration, notably the mosaics, which often contain scenes showing these large villas with great galleries running along the side, often with large towers at either end. But whether these represent, as it were, substantial improvements in the condition or a greater concentration of land in smaller and smaller number of families' hands, I think is very difficult to say.
I don't think you can argue for an explosion of population. Rather, the population was declining. One of the chief problems of the imperial government, because its taxes depended on land, was the amount of land that was being deserted. And there are lots of regulations passed regarding agri deserti, the deserted lands, and in some cases veterans were given a license to cultivate deserted lands without paying any rent for them and that sort of thing.
Well, that applies to Britain, Leo.
No, I'm not suggesting it does. I'm suggesting the empire as a whole. You can't. I don't think, in any case, even in Britain, you could argue for an expansion of population. What you do seem to have, at any rate, in these villas, is an increase in wealth, and that I would agree.
Now, I think we've established, whatever the vagueness of a lot of the evidence and the disagreements between you on some of the points of detail, that villas all over the empire, whatever else they were, they represented a very considerable investment of capital, even if it was only in building the very large structures that there are in some cases. Now, why, or perhaps I should ask, how did this way of living disappear?
If we talk about Britain and Gaul, first of all, Britain succumbed eventually to a pagan invasion of Anglo-Saxons, and there's no evidence anywhere of Anglo-Saxons inhabiting a villa. This has been attributed to their different social systems, but this doesn't mean, of course, that the land went out of cultivation. I'm pretty sure that what the Saxons were after was land that was in good order, not land that had gone to waste. Now, in Gaul, I think a distinction needs to be made between the northeast, which was colonized, if that's the word, by pagan Franks, and the rest of Gaul that was occupied eventually by other barbarians who were in fact Christians. Some of them were Arian Christians, but that's neither here nor there. And you do seem, on the evidence produced recently in that interesting book by John Percival, The Roman Villa, he makes a very good case when he's dealing with these estate names which come down to us as names ending in arch, from the Gallo-Roman arcum, meaning the estate of, that in many cases a village succeeded a villa, and in some cases, interestingly, architecturally, a church succeeded a bathhouse. Now, the evidence of produced by Roger Agache, which Malcolm referred to a moment ago, in Picardy, seems to contradict this. I think why you see so many villas in Picardy is that precisely because there is discontinuity here, and they are out in the country waiting to be photographed and not under existing villages.
Perhaps it's what Graham had in mind when he said there were a lot more villas to be found. It's not just the ones out in the open. Are there any underneath our existing settlements?
That's a very good question. I mean, I've often felt that underneath a lot of our villages, especially in the southeast, there may be well lurking the odd villa, and there certainly is a certain amount of evidence to support this. And I think the odd thing at the moment, you see, is that we have this feeling amongst us that there must be continuity, at any rate in land usage.
I'd like to take up this point about Anglo-Saxons and villas, because I think here we're very much at the mercy of a tremendous amount of very indifferent excavation. And it's now beginning to be apparent that there are a considerable number of villas, especially in the areas of primary Anglo-Saxon settlement in the east and south, where one does find fairly early Anglo-Saxon material occurring in late levels. But we now have at least one instance of a villa near Peterborough, which has only recently been excavated, where Anglo-Saxons do seem to be actually living inside Roman buildings. And if you log all the instances of early Anglo-Saxon material occurring on or very close to villa buildings, one has a distinct impression that this is not by any means just chance. I think that they probably were there. And even if the buildings do go out of use, so what? One can still have the land going on under Anglo-Saxon. First of all, perhaps by being found by Anglo-Saxons under Romano-British control, and later on by Anglo-Saxons independently. I see nothing in Anglo-Saxon social structure which debars them from taking over villas, because if you look at their settlements in their homeland, in Frisia, northern Germany, you find settlements there which are remarkably like Romano-British villas.
This is a difficulty with continuity always, isn't it? I mean, it applies to continuity from the pre-Roman Iron Age into the Roman period too, that if you are taking over an area of land which has buildings on it, the sensible place to rebuild is where the buildings are, because they're not taking good land out of use.
But presumably, gentlemen, continuity, whether it exists or not, is one of the major questions in which future research is going to direct itself. I wonder if, just to end very quickly, you could each give what you regard as perhaps the major problem, the outstanding problem to be solved in the next 10 years, somebody mentioned 50 years, as far as villas are concerned in the Roman Empire. John, you start on that one.
I would hope for more excavation on selected villa sites, often with associated field surveys. We desperately need one in Italy, for example, of all places, and if necessary it should take some years.
Yeah.
The chief problem I can see is one to which I can see no means of obtaining a solution, which is the relationship between native and Roman land tenure in Britain, between Celtic and Roman, and later, of course, between Roman and Saxon. I don't know how you set about it, I really don't.
Graham?
We need more selected excavation, and on a large scale where it is selected, to understand the relationship between the buildings of the house and the farmyards and the enclosures and the field systems, and then taking it beyond into an attempt at a reconstruction of the landscape of the late Roman period.
Malcolm?
I would agree with my three colleagues. We need all of these. Perhaps we could start by having a complete excavation of a villa. This we still don't have.
That, of course, is perhaps the most surprising thing of all, that for all the familiarity of Roman villas, there is not a single one which has been completely excavated.